Marine Biology Live is a series of monthly talks and conversations where we invite members of the marine biological community to share the work that they're doing to explore, understand and sustainably interact with the ocean and its inhabitants. Please subscribe to our channel if you want to know about future events and take a look at past events that we've recorded for you. I'm Jack Saul, and it's my pleasure today to welcome Dr. Joanne Preston, who's Reader in Marine Ecology and Evolution at the University of Portsmouth. She's also affiliated with the Zoological Society of London.
So I'm going to talk to you about bringing back the native oyster across Europe, and it's really a story of community, passion, science and action. And so I'm here today as a scientist and academic, but really I'm here to talk with my Native Oyster Network hat on and Nora hat, and to see how we're putting this into practice. So what I'm going to do is give a little overview about why we want to restore the native oyster, and how do you bring a community together to enact action to restore a lost ecosystem. So I'll talk about some of the aims of our networks, a few examples of restoration in action down in the Solent, and what I think is the next step for European native oyster and generally coastal habitat restoration. So first of all, what's an oyster? I've been studying mollusks for a long time. This was the medieval interpretation of an oyster. That's not the one we're trying to restore, it looks terrifying. This is the rock oyster or the Pacific oyster, which is an invasive species that is currently spreading around Europe and the UK, but we're interested in the native oyster, and here, there's the two side by side. And the native oyster or the flat oyster, Ostrea edulis, is called all sorts of things, the mud oyster or the European oyster. And basically it sits in the bottom of the sea and has two distinct shells. They're very beautiful. And it's 500 million years old as a group. So it's evolved for millions of years. And a really important point is it's a gregarious species. So what this means is that the larvae produced by the adult oysters that swim in the sea, when they look to find where to settle on the seabed, they want to find another oyster. They like to settle on each other. And that's how they create biogenic habitat. And that's a really important point for some of this story. So this is a quote from Leon Paul Fargue. I love oysters, it's like kissing the sea on the lips. And I think he's talking about eating them, but they are pretty interesting things. So this is my only joke. Native oysters all start off male, then improve. They become female around 2 to 3 years old when they're sexually mature. And they just do that every summer, every season. So when the temperatures reach around 16 to 18 degrees, they start spawning. And the males turn to female, some of them, and the males release their sperm and the oysters bring this in, fertilize their eggs, and they brood their larvae inside their cavity, and then they release them. And each oyster can produce around 1 million of these larvae. And the larvae will swim around, settle on the seabed, and they can find some good substrate, and that creates the biogenic reef. And what they do is they sit on the seabed and they filter the water. They sit there and pump water over their gills, eating tiny plankton and particles in the water column. And given the right conditions, they can last up to 15, 20 years. But what's happened? Why am I here today? Well, now native oyster habitat, and in fact, global oyster reefs are the most imperiled marine habitat. So this is the distribution of the native oyster and where it was across Europe from records. And these are sort of the biogeographic regions it was found in, are sort of shaded in green. And this is the sort of now seminal map from Beck et al., which shows that 85% of all global reefs have been lost. And this map here shows a colour scheme. There's a few good remaining conditions, reefs in conditions, but you look at Europe and it's either functionally extinct or very poor. And that's between 90 or 95% of historic oyster populations have now gone. And in many areas, this species is now functionally extinct. Example, the Wadden Sea. But it wasn't always like that. So here's some historical ecology, and historical ecology basically goes back into historical records, and we use the information we find to try and reimagine what ecosystems looked like before they were exploited or extirpated. And here we have a couple of extracts from a journal in the Isle of Man, a place close to many marine biologists' heart, from 1791. And it talks about a noble bank or bed betwixt Laxey Bay and Moorhold Head, extending above 2 miles in length, and lots of biodiversity associated with it. And then anyone that does oyster restoration, this map always comes up. It's the Olson's Piscatorial Atlas. It was produced in 1883, and this is probably after quite a lot of removal because of mechanized fishing due to the Industrial Revolution. But what this shows you, this map, it shows you the orangey burnt smudges on the map show you the locations of where you can find oysters to fish. And in the bottom corner there, you see a clump of oysters. They're stuck together. So there was this massive oyster bed in the North Sea, and this is from a report in 1875. I understand that there's an enormous oyster bed in the North Sea, 27 fathoms deep, nearly 80 miles long and 25 miles wide. The trawlers avoid this rough ground, as they call it, but when they do by accident get onto it, the oysters are so numerous that they fill up the trawl and almost nearly bring down the vessel. So this information is really important to try and prevent what we call the sliding baseline, which as subsequent generations experience the marine environment, they are experiencing an impoverished marine environment, and they think that is what they need to conserve to. So we need to look back and find out what it would have looked like. So how did this happen? It was from overfishing. It's easy to catch an oyster. And these are some examples of the really extensive fishing that happened. So we've been eating them since the Roman times, but these piles of shell here, and you can see the circles of people standing on this oyster shell. There was trillions of oysters in this pile. 100 million oysters landed a year in France. In 1864, 700 million oysters were consumed in London alone. And even as recently as 1978 in the Solent, 15 million oysters were landed. So we have this massive overfishing, which caused massive decline. And then it comes waves of hypoxia and disease as you get genetic bottlenecks and all sorts of things like that. So this is the depressing global landings of Oyster Cages from 1950 to 2014, the chunky blue stuff. This is from the sea around us, an amazing resource. And the red line up here are the England and Wales landings in 1887. But the good news is Oyster Cages and their beds are now a protected species and habitat. So what happens? You have overfishing removes a habitat. And remember, oysters need other oysters to settle on them. And then you create an ecological niche that invasive species come in and they shift the environment. Then with the population bottleneck and the numbers reducing, you get predation and pests have a disrepresentative effect on the population. This is the boring sponge inside a native oyster. And the remnant populations are at the whim of predation. And this has a negative feedback cycle on a loss of brood stock, reduced larval output, reduced larval settlement, and it goes round and round. However, there is hope. Here's a baby oyster settled on a native in the Solent. So we want to restore the native oyster because we have two things facing us at the moment, a biodiversity crisis and a climate crisis. The Living Planet Index here from 1970 to 2016 has halved. We're facing a warming planet. And we know one of the big things we can to restore biodiversity is restoration and climate change. And the two go hand in hand. And we really want to bend the curve backwards. We also have the political, social, ecological, and economic framework for restoration. So there's lots of legislative and policy drivers. Some are listed here. And as you know, we're entering into the decades on ecological restoration and ocean science. So it's time for action. But there's also a social shift. You used to be a bit of a weirdo when you were environmentalists. But now there's a social recognition for our need of a healthy marine environment. So because we know it mitigates climate change impacts and provides resilience, we need it for food security, and we need it for well-being and meeting our sustainable development goals. We have an ecologically coherent approach to marine resource management. We're understanding the ecosystem functions and services provided by our diminished habitats and species. And we're also starting to understand the value of these habitats. These are a couple of papers that we produced over the last couple of years that shows the economic value of habitats in terms of nitrate, phosphate, and carbon bioremediation, as well as fishery provision. So, what has an oyster ever done for you other than taste delicious when you're having it with some bubbly? So these are a nice infographic that we produced to show you some of the ecosystem services provided by the native oyster. So they can increase water clarity. They sit there and filter, they bring down particulate matter from the water column, from the sea. This is great for blue carbon habitats like seagrasses and salt marsh and kelp. They can increase biodiversity and fish production because a restored oyster reef or habitat provides a nursery ground for fish. If you have a protected population, it can spill over into sustainable fisheries. And they're real powerhouses when it comes to denitrification, removing excess nutrients from the water, which causes algal blooms. And if you live by the coast, you know all about those bright green mudflats. They can also stabilize sediments and possibly play a role in coastal protection and remove pollutants from the water. So, you know, that's also good reasons to restore them. So, bit of doom and gloom there, but hope is on the horizon. So in 2017, the UK and Ireland Native Oyster Network was founded, not the nattiest of title, and the European Native Oyster Restoration Alliance. And we've created common goals and best practice to really facilitate and fast track restoration. And I'll explain a little bit about that. We have a European scale movement that is nested in a global movement. We have government engagement through Rememare, Restoring Meadows, Marshes and Reefs, and the REACH programme. And we're trying to change policy and strategy so restoration is becoming a solution to what we face. So the Native Oyster Network sort of seeded at a masks workshop. If you don't go to the masks workshops, they're brilliant. I organised a little sort of room of people. Is there a will to do something more? In 2017, I went on a tour of all the oyster restoration sites in America, driven by the Nature Conservancy, who have been instrumental in bringing oyster restoration practice to Europe. And then I was on a bus with Alison Debney from the Zoological Society of London for around 5 days, not sleeping, going across America. And we realised if we want to replicate some of the things they're doing here in Europe and the UK, we need to make a network. So we did. We got funding and we created this network. And those are our aims, which I'm going to talk through how we do that. At the same time, a similar network was happening in Europe. And the Native Oyster Restoration Alliance, we produce these Berlin oyster recommendations, which are listed here. This is how we want to restore oysters. So we seek to support restoration in its current and historical distribution and do so in compliance with biosecurity and sustainability. And that's the likely bunch of very friendly oyster people in Berlin. So first of all, you need to create a vision. Then you need to identify barriers to restoration and focus research and evidence gathering. You need effective knowledge exchange. It's not easy to do a restoration project and we don't want people reinventing the wheel. So we need to do co-funding and maximize resources. We need to gather momentum and impact policy and legislation. And you need to produce publications, resources that help facilitate these things. Obviously, you need to get together in conferences. We also do a lot of outreach and we provide a community which supports a whole wide variety and style and types of restoration projects. And this is sort of manifested through our working groups of production, biosecurity, site selection and monitoring, and also now historical ecology. Please do check out the website, both NORA and the network. There's a fantastic amount of resources there. This is one of our monitoring recommendations handbook workshop. We get together and we write publications and then we deliver them over the subsequent year or two. This is one on oyster biosecurity. So these two workshops have been going over the last 2 years, slightly interrupted by COVID, as you quite imagine. And we have produced a suite of 3 restoration handbooks around oysters. There's the European Native Oyster Habitat Restoration Handbook, which came out last year. The biosecurity guidelines, very important. You don't want to be transferring disease or invasives, etc., across from site to site. And last chapters going to the publishers on Friday when I finish the edits, and this is the European Monitoring Handbook. And this is really key. We're going to give some universal metrics that we want all projects to monitor so we can assess performance and failures and success and drivers of those at a European scale. And that's really important for funding and quantifying ecosystem services. So over the next sort of 5 to 10 minutes, I'm going to give you a little insight to some of how this works out and a few examples of what we're doing in the Solent. So these handbooks are not for academics. They're not scientific publications. They're target audiences for restoration ecologists and restoration practitioners. Basically, all the people involved in pioneering restoration said, What do I wish I knew at the beginning to make this happen quicker and better? And so this is foundational guidance on the restoration and conservation of native oysters. And it's funded by the Environment Agency and the LIFE and driven by the Native Oyster Network. Roger Proudfoot's been instrumental in driving this forward, and it has 5 chapters all about an introduction to native oysters, how to get started, licensing and permissions a nightmare, how to do it in practice, a summary of biosecurity and how to do public engagements. And it's recognised by the UN Decade as supporting their goals. An important part of this is producing these really accessible infographics that can help practitioners communicate why they're doing this to funders. So this one here was about the sort of possible carbon flux and carbon budget of Oyster Edulis. These are the wider benefits of native oyster restoration beyond the ecosystem services. And this is one of the flow diagrams we use, which is a really functional way of helping practitioners decide whether their site is a good one and also what measures they have to take as they go through this flow diagram with different actions and important questions to ask. Of course, all of this is a huge team effort. These are the authors from the Restoration Handbook, and we had a steering committee from all the nations holding us to account and making sure we reflected their needs. So outreach is really important. We've just created this decade picture, which reimagines what we want to do. Let's bring back oyster reefs. We produce things for children's outreach, colouring books and various other things like word searches. We create fact sheets. And we've recently collaborated with BZAC for this native oyster quest. And we sent people out to go and try and find pictures of healthy native oyster to try and find a reference system. So that's a lot of fun. We've also done some pretty hardcore science, which I'm not really going to go into at the moment, but one of these papers is the 40 questions of importance to the policy and practice of native oyster reef restoration in Europe. And what we did, we got lots of experts from lots of different countries to generate 200-ish questions that we thought were important, and through a round of voting identified if these questions were answered, which top 40 would unlock restoration at a large scale. What barriers are in place to really focus both research and policy and funding to try and facilitate and speed up this restoration. And so it really aims to start that point of collaboration across different parties to really address these problems and also help funders identify key areas that need to be addressed. But fundamentally, we want to remove those barriers to restoration. And this is one paper of many in a special edition of Aquatic Conservation. So we started in 2015. There was basically 3 projects. There's a Solent, us, Essex, and Deep in Scotland. I worked really closely with Bill Sanderson. Within just 5 years, 6 years, the number of oyster projects has increased from 3 to 22. So these networks work, bringing people together, being really focused, really works in changing the restoration of this habitat. And moving forward, what do we need to do next? Well, we need to remove the legislation and licensing barriers. It's a nightmare. We need to take all these pilot projects and upscale the projects and also hatchery production and other forms of production across Europe. The big bottleneck is there aren't enough oysters. We need to continue to do the science to unlock quantification of the ecosystem services to help drive funding and policy. And in my opinion, we need to move towards an integrated approach of coastal habitat restoration. So really start looking across the seascape when we want to restore these habitats. So doing oysters alongside seagrasses and salt marsh. This is an old image from the Mediterranean of sort of early rope culture and dredging. And you can say these depict these oyster reefs. And at the moment, we just have diagrams imagining what these oyster reefs would look like. But what we really want to do is bend the curve back for future generations. So they don't have to go back into the historical ecology, but they can see these habitats for themselves because they've been restored. Thank you. So I'm going to spend around 3 to 4 minutes, just talking about what it looks like in practice, because it's a little bit messier than the flashy handbooks. So the Solent Oyster Restoration Project started as Southern IFCA going to Blue Marine Foundation and going to help our stocks aren't recovering. And so we did management plans and feasibility studies and trialled these broodstock cages to hang in marinas to try and pump out larvae, get them together, because at the time the seabed it was still being fished and there was no-take zones. And then we started putting oysters on the seabed at different densities to get permission to do larger seabed trials. So you need to do lots of habitat regulation assessments and do lots of trials. And then COVID struck and it sort of delayed our plans, which is building a restoration hatchery, doing salt mass restoration, and in 2021, in around a month's time, we'll be doing the first large seabed deployment. And the aim is to have these self-sustaining oyster populations in the Solent. So this is how we're doing it, doing a mixture of things, of these broodstock cages hanging under marinas. We've got seabed sites in Langston Harbour and the Handbooks going in this year, and we're trialling new restorative aquaculture and ranching. These are the cages that we hang underneath marinas, and they're really good for biodiversity. These are all the species we find living with these oyster cages, including the European eel, which is critically endangered. And we've done the science behind this, and it's not just the cages. The cages with the oysters in them support a unique community of species, and we're really trying to understand what that associated community looks like. We're building a Solent Oyster Restoration and Research Hatchery. This is our broodstock room. This is me playing with oysters, and this is our larval room. And what we're going to do, we want to produce spat on shell. So you breed oysters from the Solent that are disease resistant, and you bring them into the hatchery, you produce the larvae, you settle them onto old oyster shell, and you put that back out, and it's kickstarting a native oyster reef using local broodstock. We're also pioneering integrated salt marsh restoration. When I was in the States, I was doing concrete oyster castles they put in front of salt marsh for oysters to settle on. We don't want to do concrete in the environment in the UK, but instead we're using these bee systems, which are made of they're made of potato starch, and they degrade without any harm to the environment in around 3 to 5 years. And what we're doing, we're using those to try and mitigate erosion of salt marsh in the Handbooks estuary in the Solent. What does that look like? We're doing two things. We're doing them at different heights. We're putting oysters on these to restart a small reef. And we're also putting these structures by the salt marsh to try and encourage sedimentation and halt erosion. So the impact so far, we have 12 restoration sites, around 70,000 oysters restored, 5 billion litres of water filtered, 500 volunteers, many species we find uniquely live with the native oyster. We've released over 1 billion larvae back into the Solent. We've got 2 acres of no-take zone, and we're moving towards the big gig, which is 2 large seabed oyster reefs to be restored this summer. So my job is to, one, promote the communication, work with the networks, but also do the science that helps unlock this process. Thank you for listening.